we're going to talk about police accountability today. And that's quite important given the current climate we're in, right? Where people are calling for defunding the police. And where people are demanding justice for what the police are doing. I'm not saying it to accuse the police, but when unarmed people die by the hands of the police, it means there's some sort of dysfunction. People can use whatever rhetoric they want to help excuse themselves or whatever, but when someone does not have a gun and they die, something went wrong. And that's where police accountability comes in, right? How do we hold the police accountable for their behavior? The police stand for everything that America is not, right? America is the land of the free individual rights. You know, this is where you can be a truly free person without any government oppression. And the literal job of the police is to take rights away. They're there to stop you while you're going through your regular routines of the day and ask you questions, right? And sometimes they can take you away, or they can take your stuff, or they can take your life, depending on the context. So with that being said, given that they are sort of the necessary evil to keep everything, to essentially the way to look at it is that the police are this tiny little bit of evil that we need in order to optimize the amount of freedom there is. But every now and then, like in today's world, the amount that little bit of police, they're not optimizing freedoms. People are dying that shouldn't be dying, right? Rights are being taken away where rights should not be taken away. And that's why we have to have accountability measures. We got to keep that little bit of evil that exists, right? That little bit of yin that's in the yang that exists. Keep it optimal. And that's why we have accountability measures. So, accountability is having to answer to someone for what you did, right? And there's accountability measures woven into every fabric of democracy, right? Democracy is all about accountability, right? All of our politicians, or at least on paper, right, they're accountable to the voter, right? If our politicians start doing things that we don't like, then we don't vote them in the next time. At least that's what it's supposed to be like on paper. But, you know, since we're talking in theory here, in a democratic country, there's, you know, accountability woven into every aspect of life, right? Like, I am accountable to my boss here at SUNY Oswego, and he is accountable to his boss. And she is accountable to her boss. And she is accountable to her boss. So there, in every aspect of organized groups, there is some form of accountability. And that means that when you do something, and someone might question it. Why did you do that? Well, this is why I did it, right? And in theory, public institutions like the police and like universities answer to the public, right? So that's why the public is freaking out over black men dying at the hands of the police who are not armed. Because essentially, our taxes pay for government institutions. And again, the police are always going to be at the center of these types of debates, right? The same money that pays the police also pays the DMV, but the DMV doesn't end up killing unarmed black men. The DMV, as annoying as they are, their job is not to take away your rights. Their job is just to annoy you for like 3 hours. Once every 3 or 4 or 5 years. The police's job is to question your rights. The police's job is to be the necessary evil to keep this whole thing going. So if you're a police officer right now listening to this, or if you want to become a police officer, or you're one of those people who's super sympathetic towards the police, like myself, I would tell you that if you think it's unfair that there is so much public scrutiny of the police, then you live in la la land, because that's how it is supposed to be. This would not be America and the free America that our founding fathers created if we did not constantly scrutinize the little bit of evil that exists to optimize our freedom. So get over it. If you're like, oh, people are so against the police now, blah, blah, blah. Get over it. That's part of the job. Just like I have students who constantly question my grading criteria and my syllabus and the fairness with which I dole out grades, that's part of my job. And some of you are listening to this right now who might have already emailed me or talked to me about how I graded something, right? That I respond with anger and defensiveness and aggression. No, it's part of my job. I know that that would happen. It's a necessary evil, all right? And in some cases, I explain to you better why I did not give you the grade you wanted. In other cases, I concede, oh, you know what, you made a good point. I was unfair. So how do the police keep their folks accountable? Supervision, I'd say, is probably the biggest thing. So those of you are like, what do you mean by supervision? Well, in the police hierarchy, if we think about it, we have patrol officers. Those are usually, they will usually have the rank of officer or PFC, private first class. And then you have corporals, who are sort of your first line of supervision, but they are really not real supervisors. Then you have sergeants, and they are your we call those first line supervisors. They are the ones you answer to. A corporal might be kind of like a hall monitor, right? Whereas a supervisor is a teacher. And then a lieutenant is usually in charge of an entire shift of patrol. And then you have a captain, deputy chief, chief, assistant chief, whatever the hierarchy is up there. But nonetheless, supervisors are your sergeants and sometimes corporals. And so that is where most of the accountability occurs, is on that first line supervisory level. But the thing we have to understand is that when it comes to supervisors, these supervisors are stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if you're one of those supervisors who micromanages, your own patrol officers are not going to trust you. But if you don't micromanage enough, you're going to get fired by the lieutenants and the majors and the command staff. So they have to play this role where they just supervise their patrol officers enough to appease lieutenants and majors and whatever, captains and whatnot. So what supervisors do most of the time then is that they focus on, are your reports written properly? Did you are you wearing a seatbelt? Are your shoes shined? Right? They end up focusing on sort of these superficial things, right? As opposed to being like, hey, don't talk to someone like that. Or, hey, don't do this or don't do that. Or, hey, this is the best way to do something. And so what supervisors end up doing is they focus on what are the rules, what can you not do, and when it's something easy to enforce, they enforce those. But they will seldom, I'm not saying this is with all supervisors, but they will seldom give patrol officers advice on how to best do something, right? So they essentially will leave patrol officers to do whatever they want, unless they break certain rules, and they will be like, you can't do this. But they will seldom be like, you should do this. Because that, from a police culture standpoint would be like, get out of my business, bro. Right? The police culture believe heavily in this view that if you weren't there, you won't know, because every single police citizen encounter is unique. So if you weren't there, you don't deserve to know. You don't deserve to give me advice. You weren't there. You weren't in the moment. You weren't scared like me. You didn't have adrenaline flowing. Don't be a Monday morning quarterback. Typically, we would consider a good ratio to be 8-1, meaning that each sergeant should have 8 patrol officers under them. But what we find in reality is that ratio is off because of money constraints, right? You end up having like 14 or 15 under you, depending on the size of the agency. Some supervisors are really good, and they will do what we know, what we call coaching or mentoring. And that's what I just mentioned, but they tell you how you should move forward. And you usually see this with the brand newer officers, right? So a supervisor, so before that new recruit has been indoctrinated by the police culture, which holds this like stay out of my business thing as a pretty important value. Before they're indoctrinated by that, some sergeants will get to them and be like, hey, you should do this. Try this next time. And you see that quite often. But most of the time, what supervisors will do is they'll be reactive, right? They'll do this. They'll try to help take corrective action. Hey, I don't want to see this in your reports again. Hey, make sure to upload your body camera. Hey, make sure to turn on your body camera, right? Those types of things. You should not do these things, type of stuff. And then supervisors are also tasked by the command staff to typically do annual evaluations. And so they will look at how many complaints were filed against you. How many times did I write you up for something like not shining your shoes, not wearing your seatbelt? How many arrests did you make, right? Then you have internal affairs. So internal affairs they're usually investigators, right? Detectives who work in the department, but their main focus is to investigate police officers. Because supervisors are in this between this rock and a hard place, meaning that they seldom want to be too critical of their patrol officers because they don't want to destroy those relationships of trust. You have internal affairs that really has no skin in the game. They are not friends with anyone. And so they investigate anyone and everyone in that department. They can investigate the lieutenants, they can investigate the majors, the captains, they can investigate sergeants, they can investigate patrol officers. And so they try to find and isolate any sort of misconduct that occurs. Internal affairs can happen on both a reactive and proactive basis, meaning that reactive is when it's in response to something, right? So, and that's how like the lion's share or most of the internal investigations occur. It's when things happen on a reactive basis. But sometimes, as IA officers are conducting some of these reactive complaints, they might start seeing evidence that there is something going on. Right? They might realize, wait, we're constantly just dealing with these 3 officers. They're the ones getting most of the complaints. Or we're noticing that evidence keeps on disappearing whenever these officers are involved. Right? They start seeing things that are not kosher. And so they might proactively begin to investigate that, to figure out, is there some sort of corruption going on? Is someone taking gratuities? Right? Is someone using too much force or whatever the deal is? Or is someone only focusing on dealing why is this person only arresting black people? Right? Or why is this person only arresting white men? I don't know. Right? And so they might then start to investigate people. The problem with being in internal affairs is, and I've interviewed some internal affairs officers before, right? A lot of them will say, once you take that assignment as IA, like, you lose a lot of friends. You really, like, one of the things that this one officer told me is, like, you really know who your friends are when you take that IA role, because a lot of people will just stop talking to you. They'll just be suspicious of you. and it carries on even after you end your IA assignment, right? And because of that, so you have this blue wall of silence, right? So when you're in IA trying to investigate, a lot of officers, just like criminals, right, follow that snitches get stitches type of vibe. And so it's very difficult for IA sometimes. So what will happen other times is, like, if something really bad happens and the police chief feels like IA will not be sufficient, they'll get like the state police to come investigate it, because those people have no skin in the game. They don't care who they piss off, right? There are also, some agencies all agencies have early intervention systems. So systems that help you determine, is this person a problem, or are they showing signs of a growing problem, right? So one thing that we know is that only a small number of police officers create the most amount of complaints, meaning that there's only a few officers usually that either use too much force, or don't know how to communicate effectively with people, or lose their cool faster than other people. And so figuring out how to deal with them. The problem is, because of police unions, you can't just fire these people, right? Because police unions make it very difficult. So what you do is you try to reassign them to a different thing where they don't have to interact with people so much, right? Or you put them through remedial training or additional in-service training so that you can figure out how to make sure that they're not going to cause more problems. Now, there's also, you can also have, recruitment standards, right? And those are quite low, to be honest. Like most police agencies, you have to be 21 years old, you have to be a citizen, you have to be able to run a mile in 13 minutes. I power walk a mile in like 10 minutes. Yeah, I power walk. But like, there's also a psychological exam, and then there's like a series of in-person interviews you do, and that's all they use to really determine whether you'd be a good police officer, right? Few agencies have educational requirements. The thing is that we know that college-educated police officers tend to have better communication skills and tend to use much less force than officers who don't have the educational background. So, and also officers with an educational background tend to move up in the hierarchy or become detectives sooner than those who did not get a college education or a complete college education. So one way that the federal entities have tried to, and this is not federal government entities, but just sort of on I shouldn't have said federal, but on a larger scale, is through this organization called CALEA, right? It's a way to get accredited. So this is an organization that says if you've been CALEA accredited, it means that you fit a certain amount of minimum standards, right? And you can lose your CALEA accreditation, right? And I think it happens like every 2 years or every year. It might be every 5 years. I can't remember the exact amount of how often you have to be recertified to be accredited, but it is essentially accreditation is something that exists across most industries, right? Like you have accreditation for universities, right? If you go to some of these private universities, like I'm not going to name names because I don't want to get sued, but they're actually not accredited, whereas a university like SUNY Oswego is, meaning that you're going to be taught by professors who are experts in their field, who have PhDs or master's degrees for the most part, who have been trained in certain standards to help you improve your communication and writing skills, and not just have you parrot content, right? The problem with CALEA certification and other types of policing accreditations is that it just sets a bunch of minimum standards, right? So it doesn't really tell you how should what would a great police agency be like? And it doesn't judge you based on that. It just says, do you do these bare minimum things? And some of these bare minimum things can be quite bare, right? So, but the good thing is the things I do focus on is that, how do you report uses of force, right? And we know that that's one of the biggest things, right? That's one of the biggest things. Do you keep an eye on how your officers use force against people? Because that will really destroy community relations. So that's one thing that's really good about CALEA. But again, no one has to be a part of it. And they just set pretty bare minimum standards. Then there's also external ways that we can hold the police accountable, right? Since we're in a democracy, right? You have the way that someone becomes a police chief is they're elected or they're selected by mayors, right? So if a mayor is not happy with how things are going, they can just fire the police chief immediately and select another one. And then for sheriffs, the citizens vote for them. So if citizens aren't happy with how things are going, they vote for a new sheriff, right? So there is this accountability on the top leadership. Then you have the Supreme Court, right? Mapp versus Ohio, Miranda rights, right? That starts to control the police behavior. You can also sue police agencies and police officers for what they're doing. You also get some civilian review boards where you have a group of civilians who are affiliated with the police, who then will review certain instances of use of force or high-profile incidents, and then recommend the chief take certain action. And then you also get police auditors. So again, this is citizen oversight, people who go in randomly audit the police on various things. And that's really the thing, right? Is that if we want to make the police change, giving them body cameras won't necessarily do it, but it really needs to happen from outside of the agency. So we need to badger our lawmakers, right, to write laws that say this is how force should be used, right? These are the types of things you can do. This is how you should get paid. The problem is, right, we don't have that right now, and so you have these police unions. But if you can take everything that all the good that the police unions do for the police and solidify that into policy, right, into state law or local law or federal law, then there would be no need for police unions. There would be no need for them to galvanize these negative cultural views that really hurt the police and society. If you can say this is legal, this is illegal behavior, if you can implement evidence-based policy, procedural justice, community-oriented policing, true community-oriented policing, problem-oriented policing, hotspots policing, you would reduce a lot of these accountability issues, right? We should not defund the police. We should defund the police unions and empower police officers through policy. Raise standards. Make the standards ridiculous like the standards are for medical doctors, but pay police officers similarly. Anyways, that was it. That was it. That was the last video. You're going to have one more topic, but there's no video for that because I want to challenge you a little bit. I hope you all took something good from this class. If you learned nothing, or at least learned like one thing, you know what I mean?